5 men walked into the restaurant, and every customer kept eating. But the Hell's Angels leader at table 17 didn't move. He wasn't scared. He didn't even look up. Not until the waitress leaned in and whispered, "If you stand up, you die first." In 1 second, daylight turned lethal, a bomb under his chair, killers closing in, and the only person who understood the trap was the woman who wasn't supposed to be there. How did she know? Why did she save him? And what happens when the killers come back? Subscribe to Heart Tales, because this is where quiet strangers ignite the wildest stories. Let's check in. 1 for first-time viewer, 2 if you've seen a few, 3 if you never miss. The glass didn't shatter when Elena Walsh grabbed it. She caught it just before it slipped from her tray as a man in a pale blazer barged through the restaurant entrance, shoving the door wide enough to rattle the frame. The sudden impact twisted the bright, calm afternoon into something brittle. 3 more men followed him inside, blocking sunlight with their shoulders, their formation too tight, too deliberate for coincidence. Conversations faltered, forks hovered. A few customers instinctively lowered their voices, the way prey reacts before it understands the predator. Elena didn't lower hers. She didn't gasp. She didn't even turn fully toward them. She just set the glass back onto her tray and continued moving, slow, steady, calculated, while every nerve in her body snapped awake. The men weren't here to eat. They were hunting. She knew the rhythm of that walk, purposeful, scanning, marking positions around the room. 2 peeled off toward the exits. 1 pretended to study the wine list. And the last, the tall one with the scar dragging the corner of his mouth into a permanent sneer, followed a straight, unbroken line toward table 17, her blood iced. That was where he sat. Connor Vale didn't rise to greet danger. He never had to. He remained in his corner booth beneath the afternoon light, broad shoulders relaxed beneath his jacket, fingers resting on the table like he'd been expecting violence to arrive exactly on schedule. Elena had been warned about him, the man whose name bent spines in biker bars, whose patch, Hell Angel embroidered in stark, defiant letters, turned rivals quiet. But none of that mattered when she saw what waited under his chair. The smallest flicker of motion caught her eye as she approached with a jug of water. Light struck metal beneath the cushion, just a blink, a thin reflection, but enough to rip open a memory she'd fought for years to bury, a rectangular block, fixed against the underside, matte tape, no dangling wires. A pressure plate waiting. Her steps didn't falter. She had trained herself too well for that. But the tray trembled once against her palm. She reached his table just as the scarred man slowed behind her, close enough that she could feel the heat of his stare pressing into her back. Connor didn't look up. He simply breathed, slow and even, like a man aware the air around him had turned hostile. Elena dipped the jug over his glass, letting the stream of water mask the movement of her lips. Her voice was thin, almost non-existent beneath the hum of lunch hour. "If you stand up," she whispered, "you die first." Connor froze, not in confusion, not in disbelief. In recognition, his jaw tightened, his fingers stopped moving, his spine held perfectly still against the booth. Only his eyes shifted, a flicker sideways, not toward her, but downward, registering the threat she'd named. She didn't meet his gaze. She couldn't. Staring at him would paint her as part of this, and the men circling the room would notice. Instead, she stepped back and turned away, tray pressed to her ribs, pulse loud enough to drown out the music floating through the speakers. Behind her, 5 men tightened their perimeter around table 17, and the most dangerous biker in the city stayed seated because a waitress nobody ever saw coming had just told him how he would die. Elena moved away from table 17 with the same quiet precision she'd used all day, slipping between sunlit tables and half-finished plates while her heartbeat slammed so hard it felt like it might shake her bones apart. She forced her shoulders low, her breath shallow, her step steady. Any tremor, any visible crack would draw eyes, and eyes were the last thing she needed. Behind her, she didn't have to look to know what was happening. She could feel it through the air, the way heat rises before a flash fire. Rex Dalton, Scarface, had shifted his weight, turning slightly to keep Connor in view. One of his men near the entrance angled his body, blocking the path out. The man at the bar leaned an elbow casually, hand suspiciously close to his jacket pocket. They moved like pieces on a chessboard, pushing every exit out of reach. They were about to force the kill. A pressure trigger bomb didn't require bullets or chaos. All it needed was gravity, an instinctive twitch, a flinch, something as simple as a man standing up. Elena slipped behind the service counter, hands gripping its edge, trying to steady the trembling that threatened to take over. She stared at the white napkins stacked neatly in front of her, trying to breathe through the memory clawing at her throat. A dim apartment, a man she once trusted, the smell of cigarettes and gasoline. His laugh, as he explained how easy it was to make a body disappear if the device was placed right. "Stand up," he'd said, tapping the seat with a knuckle, "and you're gone before your brain knows you're dead." She squeezed her eyes shut for half a second. Not again, not here, not him. She lifted her head and scanned the room. Connor hadn't moved, not even a twitch, a statue bracing for impact. Only his eyes were alive, tracking the positions of the men closing in, calculating outcomes he couldn't act on. One of the customers rose from a nearby table, oblivious to the danger, stretching as he picked up his jacket. Elena nearly lunged toward him, but the man wandered out through the side exit before any of the criminals reacted. Even that small motion made Rex shift, impatience tightening across his scarred face. They were getting ready. Elena grabbed a stack of dessert plates and walked toward the back of the room, angling for a better line of sight. The sunlight outside the enormous windows glared off the water, throwing golden reflections across the floor. The whole scene was beautiful, blinding and hostile. Too much glass, too many witnesses, not enough cover. She drifted close enough to hear them. "He's supposed to stand by now," one of the men muttered. "Give him a reason," another replied. Her stomach twisted. They were going to manufacture a moment, bump the table, start an argument, stage an evacuation, anything to make him rise. She stopped beside a table that didn't need cleaning, pretending to adjust cutlery while she whispered under her breath, "Think, Elena, think." Rex stepped forward. It wasn't a big move, just a slide of his shoe across the hardwood, a shift of his center of gravity. But it was enough to make the air crackle. He was approaching Connor from the front, not from behind, forcing Connor's attention upward, forcing him to acknowledge the threat, forcing the trigger. Elena's pulse spiked. Her throat felt like fire. She grabbed a cloth napkin from her tray and moved fast, cutting a line across Rex's intended path. Her body intercepted his view just long enough to disrupt the moment. Rex's eyes snapped to her. Recognition flickered, not total, not certain, but enough that his stare lingered longer than it should have, tracing something in her face. Something from another life she wished he'd never seen. "Problem?" he asked lightly, voice scraping the air like a blade. She smiled, polite, harmless, the way Claire would. "Just clearing tables, sir." He didn't fully believe her, but he didn't move around her either. Behind him, Connor remained frozen, alive only because she kept stepping in the way of death. Rex finally turned, giving a signal Elena knew too well. Something between a nod and a twitch of his jaw. The men changed positions again. They weren't giving up, they were adjusting, and Elena understood with a cold certainty sliding down her spine that she had just bought seconds, not safety, not escape, just a sliver of time before they tried something worse. Her hands tightened on the tray. If she didn't act again very soon, Connor Vale wasn't the only one who would die in the next few minutes. Rex Dalton didn't back off for long. The moment Elena stepped away, he shifted again, his men tightening the noose with quiet, practiced movements. To everyone else, the restaurant still looked like a bright, ordinary midday stop. Sunlight warming the tables, forks clinking gently, the dull hum of conversations floating harmlessly in the air. But to her, the room had become a box with its edges slowly closing. One of the men near the entrance adjusted his stance, blocking the door more obviously now. Another leaned in toward a nearby table, pretending to glance at the menu but rotating his body so the small bulge under his shirt, the grip of a concealed weapon, was angled toward Connor. The one at the bar had slipped a hand beneath the counter, feigning interest in the liquor shelves while watching Connor through the mirror's reflection. They were done waiting. Elena felt it before they moved. That subtle prickle at the base of her spine, the instinct that had saved her more times than she wanted to count. They're going to trigger him. She walked toward the service station with a stack of dirty plates. Her movements smooth and unhurried, though her chest felt tight enough to split. As she set the plates down, she glanced sideways. Connor had not moved. Not even the shallowest shift of weight. His hands were still, his breathing controlled, his shoulders held in the exact same position she'd left him in. To the untrained eye, he looked calm. But she could read the tension in him now, the coiled awareness of a man forced to surrender every instinct he possessed. Men like Connor Vale survived because they reacted faster than the people hunting them. Sitting still was not in his nature. From her angle, she saw Rex make the next move. He tapped one knuckle against the table he stood beside, just twice, an old signal Elena recognized from the apartment she'd run away from. Move the target. The man at the bar peeled off first, heading toward the kitchen as if going to ask for refills. Another drifted toward the restrooms near the back exit, adjusting a cufflink to mask the gesture. They weren't blocking anymore, they were positioning. They were going to create an incident, something loud enough to scatter the room. A spilled drink, a staged fight, maybe even a fake medical emergency. Anything to make Connor stand up, anything to set off the trigger. Elena reached for a stack of cloth napkins, pretending to fold them as her eyes cut across the room. She tracked their trajectories, watched their angles converge. Her pulse scrambled upward. She'd survived this pattern once, years ago. The crew she'd been with then used to practice it on bar stools, couches, chairs, anything that could hold a man. She knew exactly how fast things would move once the first distraction hit. Rex stepped forward again, not toward Connor this time, but toward the nearest table of customers, a couple absorbed in their conversation, unaware of how close they were to becoming collateral damage. He would tip something over, spill a drink, startle them, make them stand suddenly. Chairs scraping, bodies moving, chaos spreading. Connor rising on instinct. She couldn't let that happen. She paced quickly toward the couple, intercepting just before Rex arrived. "Sorry for the delay," she said brightly. "Your check will be right out. Can I grab anything else while I'm here?" The couple smiled politely. They didn't notice Rex behind her, but they did stop talking, did pause, did hesitate long enough to keep their chairs from moving. Rex's expression cooled. He recognized interference now. Elena pretended to wipe the table, leaning forward to block his line of approach. Her fingers trembled slightly, but the rest of her remained a calm, forgettable silhouette. "You're in my way," Rex murmured, voice low enough only she could hear. "No," she whispered back, not looking at him, keeping her eyes on the silverware. "You're in mine." For a heartbeat, neither moved. Then Rex took a single step back, not in retreat, but in recalculation. His eyes narrowed, his jaw flexed. He gave a tiny signal, barely visible but unmistakable to her. Plan B. The men changed direction all at once, and the entire room seemed to tilt. The shift in the room was subtle, but Elena felt it like a pressure drop before a storm. One moment the men were scattered in loose positions, the next their movements synced, silent, sharp, coordinated. The lock on the main door clicked, masked beneath the chatter of a table settling their bill. Another man near the bar angled himself so he could cover the entire restaurant in a single glance. A third brushed past the service hallway, and Elena heard a faint metallic snap as something was wedged against the door frame. They weren't blocking exits anymore, they were imprisoning them. She moved along the wall with a stack of menus, keeping her posture loose and harmless, even as her pulse thrashed against her ribs. From the corner of her eye, she tracked the man near the emergency door. He reached for the red handle, fingers curling, ready to tug just enough to set off an alarm that would jolt the entire room into motion. Chairs scraping, people rising, instinct taking over, and Connor, by pure reflex, would stand. She cut across the floor quickly, stopping in front of the door before he could pull. "Excuse me," she said lightly, forcing air through a tightening throat. "That one's been malfunctioning all week. If you open it, the whole building goes off. Let me reset it first." The man paused, annoyed, but her interruption froze the moment long enough for Rex Dalton to look over. His eyes narrowed, reading her posture, her timing. A warning crawled through his expression. He murmured into the mic hidden beneath his collar, and the man near the emergency exit dropped his hand. Plan B collapsing into Plan C. Customers still ate, laughed, sipped wine, oblivious to the fact that sunlight was shining on a trap poised to kill them all. A toddler giggled at a spoon reflection. A businessman folded a newspaper. Someone snapped a picture of their lunch. Ordinary life stretched across the tables while death circled just beyond the edges. Elena stepped back, pretending to wipe down a spotless counter. But she saw Rex shift directions. He no longer eyed the exits. He was done pushing the room. He was heading somewhere with purpose. The booth at the back. Connor. Rex's stride lengthened. His men adjusted positions behind him, forming an invisible wall that cut off escape routes nobody else realized were gone. Elena's breath hitched as she followed their trajectory. The light pouring in from the huge windows turned everything bright. Almost too bright, but she could still read. The danger moving straight toward a man who couldn't stand, couldn't fight, couldn't do anything but breathe. She moved at the same time Rex did, slipping between two tables, pretending to refill a glass just to stay close. Connor hadn't turned his head, but she saw the faintest tension in his jaw, the controlled inhale he used to brace, not for violence but for restraint. His fingers were curled under the table, tendons tight. Rex stopped in front of him, shadow cutting across the sunlight. "Mr. Vale," he said softly, "we need a moment." Connor didn't answer. But Elena saw his chest rise one fraction deeper, the breath a man takes right before he moves. She stepped into his line of sight, praying he would see her before he reacted, because if he stood even an inch, they would both be dead before the glass stopped trembling. Rex didn't look away from Connor. He stood there, blocking the sunlight that had been pouring over the booth only seconds before, narrowing the world down to a single path of tension stretched tight between predator and target. The rest of the restaurant blurred into background noise. Forks clinking, soft laughter drifting from the patio, the hum of espresso machines, sounds that didn't belong inside a moment sharpened enough to cut skin. Elena felt the shift before anyone else. A coiling, silent momentum. Rex wasn't here to talk, he was here to end something. She moved a half step closer, masking her urgency beneath the calm routine of a waitress. Her hand hovered near a customer's water glass, but her eyes tracked every subtle twitch of Rex's posture, the slight angle of his shoulders, the set of his jaw, the way his fingers flexed once at his sides. He was prepping himself to make Connor rise. A simple order, a simple confrontation. All they needed was one instinctive reaction to detonate the device hidden beneath the cushion. Connor finally lifted his gaze. He didn't look rattled, didn't even look annoyed. Instead, there was a stillness in him so absolute it felt like the air hardened around him. He watched Rex the way a man watched a storm rolling toward him across open land, not afraid, just measuring where the lightning would strike. "Not interested," Connor said quietly. Rex tilted his head. "Didn't ask if you were—" Elena's stomach cinched. That tone, that shift, it was happening. She leaned forward slightly, placing her hand on the edge of a nearby table for stability, ready to intervene, even though she hadn't yet figured out how she'd do it without drawing fire from every direction. Rex lifted a hand. It wasn't a gesture for his men, it was for Connor, a beckoning, a command. "Up," he said softly. The word cracked across the air like glass. Connor didn't move, but his muscles bunched a fraction beneath his jacket, a reflex he hadn't fully contained. Elena saw it, the microshift in his shoulders, the breath he drew in preparation, the instinct screaming through his nerves to stand and face the threat head-on. No, not that, not now. Elena slid forward, deliberately brushing past the edge of Rex's arm like a server squeezing for space. Her tray bumped his elbow, not enough to be aggressive, but enough to break the moment. "Sorry, coming through," she said, voice light controlled. Rex shot her a look that sliced through her pretense. Suspicion flared, not certainty, not recognition, but something starting to fit together in his mind. She ignored him and focused on the couple at the next table, forcing herself to smile as she cleared a plate they didn't want removed. Behind her, Connor exhaled, or maybe she imagined it, but that tiny breath meant he hadn't risen. He was still anchored by her interruption. Rex let the silence stretch, his eyes bouncing between them in small, dangerous increments. He knew now that something was off. Maybe it was the timing. Maybe it was the way she inserted herself. Maybe it was the faint flicker of defiance she couldn't quite bury. Either way, he no longer treated her like background, and that made her a target. He straightened. "You're very helpful today." "Claire," he said, voice sliding dangerously into familiarity as he read her name tag again. A pulse thudded. Before she could respond, he shifted his stance, subtle, precise, and the whole room tightened around the danger only she and Connor fully understood. Rex didn't rush, he didn't need to. His confidence was the most dangerous thing in the room. Calm, patient, convinced that the world would bend to whatever he wanted from it. He dragged a chair from an empty table with a soft scrape, turned it around, and sat on it backwards, folding his arms over the backrest like he planned to stay a while. Sunlight hit the scar on his cheek, sharpening the line that split his expression into something crueler than a smirk. "You know," he said casually, "most people get nervous when I walk up to their table." Connor didn't answer. His gaze stayed fixed, level, steady. Rex leaned forward. "But not you." Elena kept her back to them, pretending to polish a spotless fork as she tried to read every movement through the reflections in the window. Connor's stillness was terrifying, not to her, but to the men hunting him. Predators hated when their prey didn't behave the way they expected. Rex tapped the chair with 2 fingers. "Got to admit, I'm curious what's keeping you so glued to that seat." Elena felt the blood drain from her face. That was the moment. The crack in Rex's certainty, the beginning of the deduction she'd hoped he would never make. She shifted her position again, placing herself between Rex and the couple behind her, so he'd have to look around her to see them. Rex glanced up at her in irritation. "Claire, honey," he said, dripping mock sweetness, "you've hovered over this section more than the AC vents. Give the man some space." The tone sent a jolt down her spine, too familiar, too close to the voice of the man she'd once escaped. She forced a small nod and stepped away, though every instinct screamed to stay near Connor's booth. Behind her, Rex continued, dropping his voice, but she could still catch it in fragments. "I know you, Vale, even if I didn't see the patch today." A pause. "You stand when you're challenged. You don't sit for anyone." Elena's breath tightened. The men near the exit straightened subtly, preparing. They expected movement now. They expected the trigger to snap. Rex leaned closer to the table. "So what's different this time?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended by a thread. Then Rex reached out, slowly, deliberately. His hand extended toward Connor's glass, just enough to brush it, to shift it, to create a moment that demanded reaction, a threat disguised as small talk. That tiny movement would be enough. Elena acted before her mind had time to catch up. She spun, pretending to trip on the edge of a rug, and slammed her tray into the table directly beside Rex's chair. Silverware clattered. A plate rattled. The noise sliced through the tense air. Rex jerked his hand back, instinctively glancing at her first instead of Connor. It saved Connor's life. For the second time in 5 minutes. Elena murmured a frantic apology, cheeks flushed, eyes on the floor. She bent to pick up a fallen spoon, but every nerve in her body was trained on the 2 men behind her. Rex stared at her back, suspicion pulsing from him like heat. Connor remained a statue, breathing, thinking, unbroken. Rex stood abruptly. "Enough games," he muttered, and in that instant, Elena understood. He wasn't going to provoke Connor anymore. He was going to force him. Rex didn't bark an order. He didn't shout, didn't make a scene. Men like him didn't need noise. Their power came from the way they controlled the air around them. He stepped forward with a calm that made Elena's skin crawl, brushing past a chair as though he was simply repositioning himself for a better conversation. But she knew better. That slow advance held the weight of inevitability, an execution already in motion. Connor didn't flinch when Rex closed the distance. He didn't even blink. The sunlight pouring through the wide windows bathed his face, catching the faint patterns of road dust still trapped in the stitching of his jacket. He looked like a man carved from the booth itself, rooted in place not by fear, but by the razor-thin awareness of what 1 inch of movement would cost. Rex planted a hand on the table, leaning in with the controlled ease of someone who thought he owned the moment. "You're gonna stand up," he said quietly, "one way or another." Elena slipped behind the nearest table, pretending to refill a glass for a couple who had no idea they were sitting in the blast radius of something far larger than lunchtime inconvenience. Her hand shook once, barely visible. Before she steeled it, the couple smiled at her. She forced a smile back. Behind her, tension snapped like an invisible cord. Rex straightened and nodded toward one of his men. The man near the front, broad shoulders, pale eyes, began walking toward Connor from behind. Another in a blazer took a slow encircling route, moving to block the side of the booth. They were hemming him in, forcing a moment that left no path except up. Elena's throat tightened so violently she almost lost her breath. Rex tapped the table. Once. Hard. The sound echoed in her bones. Connor finally moved, but only his eyes, lifting, locking onto Rex with a coldness that turned the air heavier. The stillness around him felt different now. Not resignation, not caution, something else, something harder. "I'm not standing," he said, "and I'm not asking." Rex answered. He reached toward Connor's jacket, fingers closing, not to grab him but to provoke him, to force instinct into the driver's seat. A man like Connor Vale would never let someone touch him without reacting. Their entire plan depended on that truth. Elena felt something crack open in her chest. If he reached Connor's jacket even by an inch, the reaction would be instantaneous. Stand, shift, explosion. She moved. She didn't think, didn't plan, didn't weigh the risk. Her feet carried her into the narrow space between Rex and the booth so quickly that Rex's wrist brushed her arm. The tray she carried clattered against the table. "Oh, sorry, excuse me," she said, voice bright, innocent, cutting through the moment like a blade disguised as a napkin. The customers nearby looked up, startled by the sound. A baby at a far table squealed with laughter. Sunlight flashed against the silverware on the floor, and for one more stolen second, Connor Vale stayed alive. Rex's head snapped toward her, his expression shifting from irritation to something much darker. He was done being interrupted. Rex didn't explode. That would have made him easier to read. Instead, he let silence settle around him like a tightening vice. His eyes tracked Elena with slow precision, marking her face, her posture, the tremor she couldn't quite bury in her fingers. The clatter of her tray hadn't just broken his rhythm. It had exposed her. No server overplayed coincidence twice, not when 5 armed men were closing in. He stepped closer, not enough for anyone else to notice, but enough that Elena felt the heat of his presence at her shoulder. "You sure are eager today," he murmured, the words gentle and poisonous. Elena lowered her gaze, forcing a meek smile that felt like it was stapled onto her face. "Just trying to keep things running smooth." Rex leaned a fraction closer. "You're doing the opposite." Her breath stuttered. She turned to move away, but his hand shot out, not grabbing, not touching, just blocking her path with a casual placement on the back of a nearby chair. A trap disguised as courtesy. She froze, feigning confusion instead of fear. Behind him, the men were closing the ring around Connor, one by the windows, 2 flanking the booth, 1 near the entrance. No more half measures, no more subtlety. They were ready to force the collapse of this entire room into one violent, decisive moment, and Elena knew the plan. Isolate Sumtone, create chaos, demand control. The last step was always the same: pressure the target until instinct tore them out of their seat. Rex's tone softened, but his eyes hardened. "Let me ask you something," he said quietly. "Why do you keep stepping in?" The question sliced her open. Because she knew their tactics, because she had lived under the shadow of men just like him, because she had watched one of them build the exact bomb strapped under Connor's chair, because she had spent the last 18 months hiding from that world. But she only said, "It's my section." He held her gaze long enough to unspool her lie. Then he smiled, not kindly. "You know what I think, Claire?" His fingers tapped the chair once, twice. "I think you're in the way." She didn't answer, couldn't. Her throat had gone dry. Rex stepped past her, smooth, inevitable, and reached for Connor again. This time, he didn't go for the jacket. He went for Connor's glass, tipping it just enough that the water inside sloshed. A petty move, a push disguised as inconvenience, but Elena recognized the muscle memory. It was a tester. A poke meant to ignite instinct. Connor's eyes snapped to the glass. His hand twitched. "No!" Elena surged forward again, but Rex was faster. He reached across the table, gripping the rim of the glass as if preparing to shove it off entirely. The clear liquid wobbled, sunlight shivering across its surface. "Stand up and look at me when I talk to you," Rex said softly. That was it, the exact command she'd feared, the spark that would trigger everything. But Connor didn't stand. He didn't shift. He didn't even blink. He stared dead into Rex's face with the kind of icy, unbreaking calm that unsettled even predators. Rex's confidence faltered only an inch, but enough for the front doors of the restaurant to swing open behind them with a heavy thud, enough for two men in dark security uniforms to step inside, enough for the balance to shift, just slightly, away from death. The doors didn't slam open. They swung in with the heavy certainty of men who belong to authority. Two security officers stepped into the restaurant, sunlight glinting off the black fabric of their uniforms and the badges clipped to their belts. Their presence sliced through the tension like a blade pressed against a taut wire. Several customers turned, momentarily distracted, the lull in their conversations rippling outward in small waves. Rex straightened but didn't step back. He simply shifted his weight, just enough to give himself room if things turned ugly. The men flanking Connor paused mid-movement, waiting for a signal. Their hands hovered near their jackets, where weapons were hidden beneath polite fabric. The taller of the two security officers scanned the room. His gaze moved from table to table until it landed squarely on Rex. Not Elena, not Connor, but the man radiating threat like heat off asphalt. "Gentlemen," the officer said, voice calm but carrying a firmness that resonated across the dining room, "this area's restricted for a private reservation. We'll need you to relocate." Rex smiled, slow and thin. "We're just having a conversation." "Not anymore," the officer replied. "Move away from the table." The other guard stepped to the side, blocking a straight path to the door. The position wasn't aggressive, but it was intentional, strategic. A cut across the battlefield Rex had tried to shape. Elena didn't dare breathe too loudly. Her entire body was locked between terror and relief. The fragile kind, the kind that said maybe the worst hadn't happened yet. She kept her hands loosely at her sides, refusing to draw attention. But her eyes remained fixed on Rex, waiting to see which version of him would show himself now, the calculating predator or the man who killed without warning. Rex glanced at Connor, almost amused. "Looks like you've got fans." Connor didn't speak, didn't move. He was still the anchor at the center of the room, the one person who understood that a single shift of weight would kill him. The security guard took a step forward. "Sir, I won't repeat myself." Rex's jaw tensed. His men reacted instantly, subtle position changes sending ripples across the floor. Elena felt her blood turn to ice. One wrong move and the guards would draw, the crew would respond. Then chairs would fly, tables would crash, and reflex would rip Connor out of his seat in the chaos. But then, in a moment too quick to pass, Rex made a decision that saved them all. He smiled again, wider this time, mocking but conceding. "All right," he said, lifting his hands as if surrendering to a joke he didn't find funny. "We'll give you the room." He signaled with two fingers. His men peeled away in perfect formation, one drifting toward the bar, another heading to the front door, the others cutting wide arcs around tables to avoid brushing close to the guards. As they passed Elena, Rex paused beside her. She kept her gaze lowered, pretending to be absorbed in collecting empty dessert plates. But he leaned in, voice a razor sliding across her ear. "This isn't over, Claire." The way he said her name, too smooth, too certain, sent a tremor down her spine. Then he followed his men out into the bright afternoon, and the moment the door clicked shut behind them, the air finally moved again. The door had barely finished closing when the room exhaled all at once, customers resuming their conversations in shaky fragments, chairs scraping, glasses clinking. The illusion of normalcy rippled back into place, thin and fragile, as if the restaurant were trying desperately to pretend nothing had just stalked through its heart. But Elena couldn't pretend. Her pulse was still pounding in her ears, drowning out the clatter of dishes and the music floating from the ceiling speakers. She turned toward table 17, afraid of what she might see. Connor Vale hadn't moved. His hands were still on the table, his shoulders were locked in the same iron posture. Only his eyes shifted, tracking the guards, the exits, the door where Rex had disappeared. He breathed slowly, deliberately, as if grounding every inch of himself into the seat to keep from instinctively rising. One of the security officers approached him cautiously. "Sir, you're clear now, but we recommend you stay seated for a moment until we finish securing the area." Connor's gaze flicked up. "How secure?" "Secure enough," the guard answered. "For now," but both of them knew it was a temporary fiction, a stopgap, the kind of reassurance offered in daylight to keep civilians calm. The second guard turned his attention to Elena. "Miss, you should step outside. You've been too close to whatever that was." Her fingers tightened around the edge of her apron. Too close didn't begin to cover it. Connor looked at her then, really looked. For the first time, she saw the question in his eyes, sharp and heavy. "Why did you involve yourself? Why did you save me? How did you know?" She forced herself to look away. The guards swept toward the back of the restaurant, radioing quietly as they checked the exits. For a moment, Elena stood alone, the sunlight spilling across her shoes, the dust in the air drifting lazily as if nothing deadly was hidden just beneath the surface of one cushioned chair. She knew what needed to happen next. She stepped forward but kept her voice low. "Don't move yet." Connor's jaw flexed. "How long?" "Long enough for them to think you're shaken." She swallowed. "Long enough to convince them the plan didn't work." He didn't respond. Not verbally. But something in his expression shifted. Acknowledgement, gratitude, calculation. Then, from the corner of her eye, Elena saw one of the guards kneeling under the booth, his flashlight cutting a bright arc beneath the table. He froze, shoulders tightening. "Found something," he called. The second guard hurried over. Elena felt her stomach drop. The flashlight beam steadied on the small rectangular block strapped beneath the seat. No bigger than a book, cold metal wrapped in matte tape. The guard exhaled through his teeth. "Pressure device, just like the reports." His voice dropped to a mutter. "They plan to blow the whole place." Connor remained still, unmoving, unflinching, but his eyes darkened, something cold and deadly settling behind them. The guard straightened and addressed him carefully. "Sir, we're calling the bomb squad. Don't try to get up. Not until they get here." Elena's throat tightened. She stood just behind Connor now, close enough that her shadow crossed his shoulder. He spoke without turning. "How did you know?" The question wasn't angry. It wasn't suspicious. It was something softer, confused, almost unwillingly impressed. Elena's voice came out barely above a whisper. "Because I've seen it before." The words felt like pulling a scar open, and from the way Connor's eyes sharpened, she knew he heard everything she wasn't saying. The restaurant emptied in waves, first the curious, then the frightened, then the ones who couldn't decide which they were. The guards ushered customers out with practiced calm, their voices soft, steady, reassuring. Sunlight from the wide windows grew brighter as the room cleared, the space stretching larger, quieter, more vulnerable. Elena stayed near Connor's booth, though every instinct told her to run. Distance meant safety. Disappearance meant survival. But her feet didn't move. She watched the guards mark off the area with thin strips of tape, watched them radio for the bomb squad, watched the world she'd worked so hard to rebuild tilt again beneath her. Connor didn't look at her until the last patron slipped out the door. Then slowly he turned his head. "You've seen this before," he said, not questioning her, confirming it. Her throat tightened. She wanted to lie. She wanted to bury every part of her past in the quiet diner shifts and borrowed name pinned to her chest. But she couldn't lie to the man sitting on top of a trigger she had recognized instantly. I used to know someone who built things like that, she murmured. Used to. Connor's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in understanding, the kind that recognized the shadows he'd spent his own life walking through. One of theirs? He asked quietly. Elena didn't answer. Silence was answer enough. The taller guard approached again, keeping his distance from the chair. Bomb team is 5 minutes out, sir. Once they're here, they'll lift you with a support rig. You'll need to stay completely still. Connor gave a curt nod. His voice came out steady. I can manage that. The guard turned to Elena. Miss, you should step outside with the others. Her fingers twisted in her apron. The simple gesture felt like a betrayal of the persona she wore. Claire would leave. Claire would step out and watch from the sidewalk, safe and shaken. But Elena stayed rooted. I need a moment, she said. The guard hesitated, then nodded. Stay behind the line. He moved off. Silence settled between her and Connor. For the first time since she'd spoken the warning that saved his life, Elena let herself meet his eyes fully. They were clearer now, sharpened by the near death he'd been forced to sit through. There was something else there too, calculation mixed with gratitude, confusion threaded with instinct. He studied her like she was another problem to solve. Who's looking for you? He asked. Her pulse thudded. No one. He raised an eyebrow. She swallowed. Not anymore. It was the truth and a lie, tangled together the way only someone who'd fled a violent life could understand. Connor's jaw tightened, a tiny reaction, but loud enough for her to hear the message underneath it. He didn't believe her. He didn't push, but he didn't believe her. Whoever did this, she said softly, glancing toward the device under his chair. They weren't here for the restaurant. Obviously, they came for you. Also obvious. She hesitated. You don't seem surprised. Connor's eyes flicked toward the door. Men like me make enemies. Elena exhaled a shaky breath. These ones won't stop. He didn't respond, but she could tell he already knew that. Outside, sirens wailed, growing louder, closer, drawing a red and blue pulse across the windows as the bomb squad van rolled into view. Elena stepped back, heart thundering. The moment of truth was coming. The bomb squad moved with a precision that made the room feel smaller. 3 technicians in heavy gear stepped past the taped boundary, their helmets reflecting long streaks of afternoon light. They knelt around the booth, speaking in clipped, controlled murmurs as they unpacked a metal rig and a cushioned support cradle designed to distribute weight evenly. Elena watched from the edge of the room, fingers gripping the back of an empty chair. Every word exchanged between the techs struck her like echoes from another life. Measurements, pressure thresholds, disarming sequence. She recognized too much of it, knew too much of it, and hated that knowledge more with each passing second. Connor stayed absolutely still. His breathing barely moved his chest. One of the techs slid the cradle under the table's edge and nodded. All right, sir. We're going to lift you in one motion. No shifting, no helping, just trust the rig. Connor's eyes flicked briefly toward Elena. Just one glance, but it held something that hadn't been there before, like he'd tethered himself to the steadiness in her gaze, using it to anchor his mind. She held that gaze, refusing to look away. The technician counted down. 3, 2, 1, lift. The rig hissed softly as it rose, distributing Connor's weight upward in a smooth, controlled pull. The device beneath the seat was exposed fully now, its edges wrapped tight in dark tape, metal plate gleaming under the flashlight. Elena's breath hitched. The tech froze. Got it. Pressure stable. No trigger. They slid the seat away from Connor's body, inch by inch, until there was space for him to step off the cradle platform.
Sir, you're clear. For the first time in nearly an hour, Connor Vale stood.
Sunlight caught his face, sharpening the lines of restrained fury carved there. He looked at the bomb, then at Elena. and the quiet promise in his expression said everything. This wasn't over. Connor didn't leave the restaurant right away. The bomb techs cleared the device, sealed it in a hardened case, and rolled it out past the wide windows where the police cruisers still pulsed red and blue across the pavement. Officers clustered near the entrance, radios crackling, whispers threading the air like static. But Connor remained near the booth, shoulders squared, jaw locked tight, not shaken, just coiled. Elena stood several feet away, hugging her arms as if steadying herself against a cold draft. But the sun outside was warm. The only cold in the room came from memory. When Connor finally stepped from the cradle platform, he crossed the empty dining room toward her. His boots made soft, deliberate thuds against the polished floor. Elena's breath wavered. She didn't know what he would say. She didn't know what she could say. The man she'd saved had the look of someone who'd stared directly at death and now wanted answers with the same intensity. He stopped a foot from her, close. Too close for the mask of Claire, the waitress, to hold up. "Start talking," he said quietly. Her voice caught. "About what?" Connor's gaze hardened. "Don't insult us both. You recognized that device before anyone else. You saw them coming before anyone else. And you stepped between me and a kill order twice. That doesn't happen unless you know exactly who those men are." She swallowed. Her throat felt scraped raw. She had promised herself she would never go back to that world, not even in words. "You don't want my story," she whispered. "I do," Connor said, "because it just saved my life." The guards had stepped outside to coordinate with police, leaving them alone in the vast space that only an hour earlier had pulsed with sunlight and laughter. Now the emptiness felt cavernous, echoing with unasked questions. Elena stepped back, her hands trembling. "I used to know someone," she said, the words barely audible. "Someone who worked with people like Rex Dalton, someone who built things like that bomb. I didn't know they were coming today. I didn't know they were after you. I just knew what I was looking at." Connor studied her like she was a puzzle he couldn't decide whether to trust or break open. "Why did you run from them?" he asked. Her breath hitched. "Because staying meant I wouldn't survive." He didn't push her further. Instead, he glanced toward the large windows where the bomb techs were loading equipment into their van. They came prepared. "Today wasn't random." "I know," she said. "Someone tipped them off about me." Elena's stomach tightened. "Or about us." Connor's eyes flicked back to her, sharp. "Us? You're not the only one with enemies," she murmured. Silence settled between them, heavy and dangerous. The door opened briefly, and one of the guards stepped back in. "Sir, we need to escort you out the back. The crowd out front is growing." Connor nodded once, then looked at Elena. "You're coming with me." She blinked. "What? "No, I can't." "Yes," he said, "because they saw you too, and now they'll look for you as hard as they look for me." The guard added, "Ma'am, it's safer if you leave through the employee exit." But Connor cut in. "She leaves with me." Elena stared at him, stunned. She'd spent her whole life trying to slip through cracks, avoid notice, erase her trails. Being tied to a man like Connor Vale was the opposite of disappearing. "You don't know what you're asking," she whispered. "I do," Connor said. "I'm asking whether you want to stay alive." Her breath faltered. The truth wrapped itself around her ribs, tight and undeniable. Rex Dalton had looked straight at her before he left. Not a glance, a look, a mark. The guard led the way toward the back hallway. Connor held out a hand. Elena hesitated only a second. Then she took it, and for the first time in 2 years she wasn't running alone. The alley behind the restaurant was flooded with sunlight, bright enough to sting Elena's eyes as she stepped through the back door beside Connor. The guard closed it behind them with a quiet thud and moved ahead to check the path, leaving Elena and Connor in the narrow stretch between brick walls that smelled faintly of salt, asphalt, and the ocean drifting just a few blocks away. Connor didn't let go of her hand until they reached the corner of the building. When he finally did, his palm lingered for half a second. as if confirming she was still there, still alive, before he pulled back. A black SUV rolled to a stop beside them, tinted windows gleaming in the sun, the back door open from the inside. "Move," someone ordered, but not unkindly. Connor guided Elena into the vehicle, sliding in beside her, the door shut, sealing them in a cool, dark cabin that smelled faintly of leather and gasoline. The city moved past them in bright blurs as the SUV pulled into traffic. For the first few seconds, neither of them spoke. Elena watched the sunlight strobe through the windows, her pulse still shaky, her thoughts tangled around what she'd almost run from and what she'd run straight into instead. Connor broke the silence first. "You didn't freeze," he said softly. "Most people would have. Hell, most men I know would have tripped over their own feet trying to get away from Dalton." Elena stared at her hands, fingers tightly laced together. "Freezing was never an option where I grew up." He studied her profile for a moment, reading the things she didn't want to say. "Then you know what's coming," she nodded. "Rex won't let this go. Not after today." Connor leaned back, jaw tense as he replayed the device under his chair, the men surrounding him, the lethal choreography she'd disrupted more than once. "He wanted a message," Connor said. "Something fast, public, easy to disguise." "What stopped him was me," she replied, the words sounding smaller than she meant them to. Connor didn't disagree. Outside the SUV, the street opened into the waterfront, sunlight shimmering off the ocean. Boats bobbed at their docks. Tourists strolled past gift shops. Life moved on in brilliant daylight, unaware of how close it had come to being shattered. Connor turned toward her fully now. "You said you'd seen that device before. You said you knew people who built them." His voice deepened, a weight of a leader slipping into place. "Tell me what you know." Fear curled tight around Elena's spine. She'd kept her past buried for so long she'd almost convinced herself it was dead. But the look in Rex Dalton's eyes earlier proved otherwise. "I left someone," she whispered. "Someone dangerous. Someone who won't forgive it. Name?" She shook her head. "Giving him a name is like giving him oxygen." Connor exhaled, slow and controlled. "Then we'll find another way." "We?" she echoed. "You saved my life today," he said. "That makes us connected whether you want it or not. And if Dalton comes for you, he comes for me. If he comes for me, he'll use you." She shut her eyes, trying to breathe past the truth of it. When she opened them again, Connor's gaze was steady, unwavering. "Whatever comes next," he said quietly, "you're not facing it alone." The SUV turned toward the harbor road, sunlight washing over them both, and for the first time since she'd fled her old life, Elena felt something that wasn't fear. A direction, a beginning, a war they were already in together. Some stories don't end when the danger passes. They end when two lives collide in a way neither can walk away from. Elena thought she'd buried her past. Connor believed he could face enemies alone. But after today, both of them know the truth. Survival isn't a solo act, and the war that found them in broad daylight is only beginning. If you want to see how far they're forced to go, what comes hunting them next, and how this unlikely bond becomes the only thing keeping them alive, make sure you subscribe to Heart Tales, hit that like button, and stay with us. The story continues.